Hello, and welcome to a special edition of the Storied Arcs podcast. I am your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And today we have a very special guest, co-author of Deep Cuts and many, many other things, Joe Clark. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, guys. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. This is a real treat for us. Thank you.
Well, thanks.
So I think the first thing we want to know is, we also, if some people say that it's not interesting enough to talk about, but if it is, your personal comic origin story, did you grow up reading comics? Did you get into it later in life? What made you want to become a comic creator? Because obviously you have multiple vocational interests here.
Yeah. Well, we'll start with that. Is that I spent much of my life as a professional musician and music educator. And you know, I'm a trumpeter, and I teach at DePaul University and Northwestern University, and yeah. But with the comics, where the comics come from is my dad got into collecting comics in the '90s during the big boom. He had a huge comics collection in the early 1960s that he just gave away. Oh. And I spent the rest of his life lamenting that he had like essentially the complete Spider-Man. He was a huge Ditko head. And so I think in the 90s there was a lot of that. And so he had a lot of reprints too. So I lucked out that I started I kind of have a weird entryway into comics in some ways because I really did mostly just read comics that my dad read as a kid or that he was interested in the 90s. So like I know that Kyle, for example, talks about reading Batman in the 90s. Kyle Higgins, my co-writer, one of my best friends. And like the Batman I read was like the Neil Adams stuff, you know. I read a lot of Carmine Infantino Flash, you know, like that was
yeah, classic stuff.
And even like Classics Illustrated, the Gold Key stuff, Little Lulu, you know, like really obscure. I've got a complete DVD now of all of the Jerry Lewis comics. So like, I came up in kind of a weird corner of things, and really didn't have too many friends who were into the whole comic book thing until I met Kyle Higgins in a jazz band of all places in high school.
Hey, high school jazz band.
Yeah.
As a former high school jazz band player myself,
I didn't know you were too. All three of us.
Yeah, I'm a saxophonist on an alto. Moved to baritone sax.
Nice, excellent.
Eventually. Yeah. I was gonna ask because obviously all of your comics work has been written with Kyle, and Kyle is someone who, strictly speaking, from a comic side, has an incredible CV. You know,
sure, yeah.
Whether it's his creator-owned work at Image or all the work he's done at DC and now doing something at Marvel. I was wondering, you know, how you guys kind of hooked up, and it sounds like it started well before any professional work.
About 25 years ago, we literally met in big band. And Kyle remembered this. I have to admit, I forgot, but Kyle reminded me that when we, trumpeters can sometimes be a little cagey and standoffish. So we were, even though we were in band together, we didn't like immediately kick it off until it was announced that Bryan Singer was directing the X-Men movie. And I brought it up in passing about how excited I was, and Kyle's like, "You like comics?" And I was like, "You like comics?" It was like, when Millhouse met the other Millhouse, essentially. Yeah. And
yeah, that's great.
And from there, like, we found out we both like movies, so I think both he and we watched Memento and Pulp Fiction together for the first time, you know, and like just sort of doing that teenage cinephile thing.
Kyle also a director as well, works in has worked in film and all that as well. It's kind of his other gig outside of comics, I guess, would be that. Yeah.
And so when it came time for college, he went to Iowa at first, and then went to Chapman in LA, and I went to DePaul to pursue playing jazz trumpet and writing music. And so we stayed in touch through that whole time, though. Whenever he had a short film, I scored it. There was a time in, it would be the kind of thing where, it's all student films and stuff. So like, I wanted to get a drummer to play on it, and he's like, "Well, I'm leaving in a day," so I wrote all the drum parts before I wrote anything else, for these. And so one of those short films was called The League, which became the basis for Cowl, which was sort of our first massive verse thing. And
Became the first massive verse.
yeah,
thing.
absolutely, yeah. Ex post facto.
Yeah.
But yeah, he would talk through scripts. He was, when he was doing the New 52, he would, he would
As Nightwing or
yeah, exactly. Nightwing.
Yeah.
He also did Deathstroke, I believe. And that's the right one, right? Yeah,
I think
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm fairly certain.
Deathstroke, Deadpool, Deadstroke, Deathpool. There's a lot of them.
Right.
There's a lot of bleed between the two, definitely. Yeah.
By design, even.
Yes.
And then he helped me with my records. So like my first record was a big band record, and he hooked me up with a cover artist and design. And
By the way, you have a new big band record last year, right?
yes, that's right.
I just listened to the whole thing today.
Thank you.
Real quick, I wanted to ask that because that first album was 2012, 2013, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
I listened to it. It's called Lush, and I noticed the cover art is drawn. It's an illustration.
Yeah.
And I was trying to find out who the artist was because there's such a great style to it. It's got like a femme fatale on it, and you got kind of like this Dick Tracy kind of fedora, trench coat kind of thing. I was curious who the artist was because I couldn't find it. I wanted to bring that up at some point.
That was Eric Wright. You remember Eric Wright? He does the children's comics now too. Tommy Pickles, I think what it's called. Not Tommy Pickles, something Pickles. Let me see.
Tommy Pickles, I think, is Rugrats.
Yeah. So excuse me. What a Frankie Pickle. Excuse me.
Okay.
Eric White. Excuse me. I misspoke. But right. Eric's great, and it's so funny. You guys, I've been trying to play catch up on your previous episodes leading up to this. You guys have nailed like our influences in terms of Cavalier and Clay and Cloud Atlas. And it's like, yeah, that's like stuff that really moves me. And Eric White was the guy who did the Escapist comics.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
yes. Which were so cool. Like,
yeah, right.
I found about those like years after I read the book.
Same. Yeah.
And apparently that movie is still in production, so we'll see if that ever happens. I think at this point just leave it alone. But
actually, I think Shavon said it might become a TV series now.
I think
maybe like a prestige
TV would be
would
better
probably
format.
be better given that book. But
sure, yeah.
Oh, that's
but
great.
I was just amazed that I actually didn't read that as like the pitch on like the back of, how like anytime there's a new first issue, it's always like it's this meets this, the little elevator pitch. I'm like it could have been like, this is the jazz version of Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which also like was cross medium. It was like he didn't write a comic book about the origin of comic books. He wrote a novel, a Pulitzer Prize winning novel about it. And here you didn't make a jazz album about the history of jazz. You made a comic book about the history of jazz. And it's not a history book. It's a memorial to the history of, I don't know. You probably have better language for it than I do, but
no, sure. It's
an homage,
an encomium, a song of praise, right?
There we go. Leave it to the
so
professor to give the flower language there. So I'm curious. So you said you went off to college to at that point you knew you want to study jazz and composition and all that. So at what point, I guess clearly in a younger part of your life, did you feel or did you have a sense that music and specifically jazz was going to be a path you wanted to follow?
There was a moment in about third or fourth grade when I saw Louis Armstrong play.
Wow.
Whoa.
And I know this is insane a little bit. I think a lot of musicians, you kind of have to not be fully there to want to continue doing this. But like there is this joy to Louis that like I'm still chasing. And
is that why you picked trumpet?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
It was never even a question. And so I play piano just well enough to compose and write. But trumpet was always like the moment I was aware that was something that you could do, it was like, oh yeah, I'm doing that. And then from there, in past years, I've sort of found a slot as a writer arranger, a composer arranger, and so I'm still playing, but like that record just mentioned, I composed that whole hour, 45-minute long suite, however long it ends up clocking in, and I write the children's shows for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra,
Right.
their outreach program, the Once Upon a Symphony stuff,
That's awesome.
and yeah, so it's been I'm very lucky, I get to keep doing all these things. Like 12-year-old me got his wish. Like I get to just read comics and do jazz all day. And
Yeah.
it's
Well,
been
I
great.
mean, and like
The dream, right there. Yeah, come on.
and I have to say I'm insanely jealous because I have also diverse interest, but to achieve them all at that level, it's like DePaul's a very legit school. Chicago's a Big Five orchestra. Image Comics is like the name brand of indie comics. And all of the, I said we're not going to talk about it, but all the Massiverse stuff also just like, I would imagine that's just like Candyland for you guys. Like that's the books you wanted to be
amazing.
reading in high school.
And the thing that's so funny, cards on the table. Like I started on third base with comics. I feel that with jazz, I clawed every millimeter up. Yeah, I'm still trying to get there, and truly paid my dues with that. And so it's surreal to me sometimes with the comics thing because it's like I get to work with such incredibly talented artists. Whether it's with deep cuts or any other project, just the ability to write something protean and very loose, and then bring that to an artist and get all of this feedback and storytelling and really work collaboratively with such artists at an incredibly high level. Like I've really lucked out on this front.
Well, hey, I mean, don't apologize for the fact that your high school friend went in and became one of the like a brand name in the industry.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's that's out of your hands. This is how it goes. Kyle put in the work. Like I said, all his work and I mean, I remember when he announced he was launching Radiant Black. I think I don't know if at that point maybe I'm sure he had plans for this bigger thing, but when he launched his own book like that with this idea of all the talent he brought over from the people he had worked with on the Power Rangers stuff, and to watch that snowball and I go to a ton of comic conventions, and one thing I always notice is Kyle is so great to talk to, but the fan interaction of like the intense love for this, like they're so into Radiant Black and the Massiverse. Like he's created this fan base of folks that love it, and the way it expands and bringing in more writers and artists and all that. And you're just like, I mean, I'm sure you grow up like you got your Batman story, right? You got your Spider-Man story, but to create a property that you own and you put it out there and have the response it is, and that people that and you want to work with. And I can't imagine how that feels for him. That's got to be awesome. So, I mean, yeah, it's I don't think you got to apologize for hey, this.
Oh no, I don't even see it as an apology as much of it as an acknowledgement,
Sure.
And a little bit of thanks. Yeah. The crazy thing, if I really want to blow your mind here, is that Radiant Black's inception and Deep Cuts happened, I believe, at the same convention. It was definitely at the same time because we were in New Orleans doing research for Deep Cuts. There was a couple big images and big locations I wanted to share with Kyle as we were planning this out. And that was when Marcelo and Kyle were essentially said, well, let's do our own thing. Let's do Radiant Black. And so I remember Kyle riffing on the name Radiant Black and then thinking of like, well, what could the production company be? And I was like, why don't you call it the Spooky Boys? Because it sounds like you're spooky. And that ended up in Deep Cuts. And it was like it's just a stupid joke. But like, for example, one of the very first image and the last image, we're in spoiler territory already.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
The first and last image of Deep Cuts is a very specific real corner that is coming out. It's at Congo Square, right in Louis Armstrong Park. That's like a place where African music was performed in the antebellum South, even. something that makes New Orleans kind of unique is that there were African cultural practices in terms of religion, music, language, etc., that were retained to a degree that just would not be feasible or would be actually punished outside of Louisiana. And so that's like a very particular corner, particular image that our story begins where you could argue jazz physically began. And so I had to show him. We had to go down there.
That's, there is something. I guess if you hadn't said that, and I looked at those pages, I probably would have said, "This feels like a real place." Like this feels like it does feel intentional in terms of wanting to show. Like if not so much the beginning, but definitely the final shot when you're at the end, that definitely felt like because now we're in the 70s there, but we're moved into more modern day versus 1917 or whenever it starts. That felt like it meant to be a real establishing shot. So I said, even if you hadn't said that it definitely, you get that across, that we're bringing you up to modern times, as it were, quote unquote. So that's really cool in terms of a setting like that. But I'm guessing the other like names of places, things like that, those all fictionalized, or like names of bands and things like that, or that they probably trace onto like real life people and bands and places. But
it's very Cavalier and Clay in that way. Yeah. We've retained certain like political frameworks. Cavalier and Clay, they've got Salvador Dali and stuff like that. But so I guess I should say how the project started. The way it began, I think that'll answer this. It began with Eric Stevenson of Image and Kyle were talking in Portland, and they were talking about a comic about baseball. And you've name dropped Ken Burns a couple times, so baseball and jazz have a lot of characters. There you go.
we're recording this on opening day right here, so yes.
Oh yeah.
Go Cubs.
Well, you know what though, better than if you said go White Sox, because then I would have felt sorry for you.
That's
true. Yeah,
bless them.
One is despicable, one is pitiable.
Just kind of sad. Yeah.
And
anyway.
So Kyle, Eric said Eric is a huge music fan with a giant vinyl collection, and Kyle and him have hit off on that. And so Eric turns to Kyle's like, "You should do a jazz book." And Kyle's like, "I don't have the historical background in whatever way, but I do know a guy who teaches, jazz history and jazz arranging, and has been, and so I was literally sitting in this chair with my daughter in one arm, and the other arm I was doing an arranging project, writing music.
Multitasking.
And then I got a phone call, put it on speaker, and he's like, "Do you want to co-write a comic book? And you got to let me know right now, because if you say yes, I think this will happen. If you say no, I don't think it will." And so I was like, "Yeah, sure, great, let's do this." And so in coming up with what we wanted to tell, there's a lot of really good jazz comics out there. There's the famous some European ones like the Coltrane book. You guys know Dave Chisholm at all? Mm-hmm. He lives in upstate New York, and he's super talented. And so I didn't want to step on those toes. Number one, and also really truly didn't want to tell like some sort of sanitized white savior story. I didn't want to do La La Land,
Right.
And I didn't want to do something about how jazz was dead either, because it's not. It's and I think sometimes there's this romanticization of the past that really that doesn't get the full picture of how resilient and creative artists were against that. So the first thing is thinking of like what we wanted to convey in this story, and so it really came down to like this idea that this is also, I guess, another very influential text in all this was right when Herbie Hancock and the late great Wayne Shorter published this open letter to the next generation of jazz artists, and it was this talking about the connection between different artists, about the false dichotomy of success and failure, and the importance of music beyond just the notes. And so thinking about that, it's like, yeah, and like what would really inspires me is like seeing how something in the 1920s may not have fully come into fruition until later. There's all these stories in jazz about really interesting characters that aren't names that people know right off the bat. Freddie Keppard, for example, was a trumpeter in Chicago, one of the first guys to move from New Orleans to Chicago. And he got offered the very first jazz record contract, and he said no because he didn't want people stealing his ideas. He thought that by recording it would be fossilizing the ideas, and he got so paranoid he would perform with a handkerchief over his fingers.
So we couldn't see that.
Yeah, when people stealing his. So like, there's so many interesting stories like that. But if it isn't for Freddie Keppard, then Joe Oliver doesn't come to Chicago. And if Joe Oliver doesn't come to Chicago, then he can't call Louis Armstrong to come up. And if Louis Armstrong doesn't come, then what happens? So many of these like. So much of what I like about jazz is that very broad historical connection. And you mentioned, Cloud Atlas and Kettler and Clay. Another thing that Kyle and I both love is The Wire. And it's the idea like, there's all these like different strata of people coexisting, sometimes directly interacting, sometimes interacting in ways they can't understand. And it's all like one big, mess of humanity that sometimes comes together and sometimes doesn't. And so that was the idea. And once we had those bones in, the first thing Kyle was like, wow, this is a big swing. So let's swing for it. Let's get like a diverse team of artists, get a whole team together that could tell the story in a variety of different ways. Getting that together was really interesting. Finding artists like for example, our first couple issues. This is the type of trenchant comic insight that Kyle has, where he's like, the first issue is going to be the hardest because nobody wants to draw hats because hats take forever, and back then everyone wears a hat. So I was like, wow, interesting. It's like, everybody wants to draw the 60s and 70s because they look cool. Because there's like an innate coolness factor that can then like parlay into getting booked for other gigs. But if you're the hat guy, then you're just drawing hats. And so thankfully we were able to get Danilo on that. He had just gotten off of The Trap. Man, I'm like, it was so great hearing that you guys have read The Trap. I think that's a super underrated book of theirs.
Oh, and, yeah. I mean, just the idea is like, when Kyle kickstarted that and I saw that, that was back in 2020, and it's like, I'm running it with Lance Briggs. Like, wait, like Lance Briggs? Because I know, I know that is. I know, like, he really, I got to check this out. So yeah, that was, I was, and obviously I was, again, it was 2020, it was, people putting art out there to get funded, and with the way comics were at the time, it was, of course I want to back this, because again, Kyle at that point had become a name that I trusted. If I saw his name on a book and he's back, I'm gonna pick it up. I'm gonna read it. So I enjoyed that a lot. That was a blast. Yeah.
COVID actually is a part of this story too, because as we were getting this all together, like Kyle and I in the beginning didn't know whether I would just be doing research, providing like color or doing some sort of editorial role, or whether I'd be writing. We kind of had like a framework for a big story, but from there it's like it was a new frontier essentially. And I had a ton of concerts booked in 2020. So I was like, man, I don't know what I'll be able to do. I'm not sure if I can start a whole new artistic thing. And then like in 1 week, I lost $15,000 worth of gigs. And and I was like, hey man, I'm free.
I'm looking at the calendar now, and it seems, I guess. And
the ironic part was, so it was like a Looney Tunes stock market or something, because it's like, oh, things look like they could be bad, and then like the bottom falls out, and then like all these older musicians who have been working nonstop, suddenly they're like, well, I've always wanted to get an arrangement, or I've always wanted to get this. So suddenly I had all my music, all this work back, which is a different form than comic books. So Danilo did the first issue. Helena, like you mentioned in previous issues, has done a lot of cover work, but she's always, I think she has a very strong narrative sense, and like especially in terms of like the smaller gestures, So
I loved her character design. I thought it's such a stark contract, but yet I think what I said to Mike was, there's something about that I don't know if that's what the 1920s will look like and felt like, but it's what we've come to internalize it is.
Sure,
And
yeah.
so, like maybe it's through pop culture. So you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, I mean, you feel like that's what it was like. That's how people looked, and just in terms of body shape, like all of that is like, oh, of course, that's just what we've come to accept of what the late 20s, were like then. She captured that perfectly.
I'm so glad we got her too, because there was a second where it looked like it wasn't going to work out, and we had to get another artist. And the original script, I actually haven't gotten to your covering of issue 2 yet, but there's a lot of slant references to the Wizard of Oz in that, because that was written in Chicago. L. Frank Baum's house is been sorry, that's my daughter screaming the other room, if you can hear that. But L. Frank Baum's house is gone now, but where it was, they have a yellow brick road. And so Gale is Dorothy Gale. That, we got that from there. Geldstein literally means yellow, gold brick, yellow brick. And then every character subsequently, she's going on a journey of discovery into a new land. The train's called the Cyclone, right? Stray Ray with a straw hat. Stro is German for straw. It keeps going. And
you are giving us so much. We're talking to her next week.
Oh, beautiful!
Yeah.
I think we're gonna blow her mind with like, we just discovered all this on our own.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, we saw
readers.
right through it. That's incredible. That's awesome. That's
Nick
awesome.
Woodman keeps calling his trombone his axe. And then when we finally get to Leo, he's the only one with any bravery to sort of call her out on this whole thing. And he wears that big fur coat. And so
when you lay it out like this, it's so obvious. I mean, it's like, how did we not get this?
Yeah.
I'm so excited for you to reread it now, because
and now Joe's the man behind the curtain, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You guys are the wizard there. That's fantastic. That's awesome.
We have at least 4 or 5 direct quotes from the film in there too. So if you can find those, that's when you get the silver ring at the end. So
wow.
Well, yeah, now I have to go back and read.
Well,
just
that, and I have to rewatch
now.
Wizard of Oz because I haven't seen it since I was a kid. Although I was just debating with my parents-in-law about whether my daughter is old enough to watch that movie yet.
Yeah.
And they were like, absolutely not. Those flying monkeys are terrifying.
This is a controversial take, but I think that it's important for children to be scared in film, especially because once they know, I got to that scary movie and I'm still here.
I think there's something to that. I will also note that my daughter's 2.5.
Okay, yeah, maybe your in-laws are right there.
In that case, just jump right to Return to Oz, the sequel, which is 1,000 times scarier.
Yeah, I mean,
but what I liked about what Helena did, like you say, there's a way to do that whole subtext in a more cartoony kind of way, and some other artists, they thought about maybe making more caricature, but the way she has everything rooted, it's just sort of in the background. It's just like a support system, and she just did a wonderful job with all these subtleties that I'm really excited to see her do more interior work in the future, because she's great.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I'm curious. Well, just as you and Kyle were plotting this out, and you had this thread of as you said, this kind of connection from artist to artist, passing down generations. Was it always going to be this kind of narrative anthology where you have you have separate stories moving through time with kind of a loose thread being the specific piece of music, or was at any point it was like, well, we'll tell a more tightly narrative? How did the thinking go into the literal construction of the story?
From the very beginning, we wanted to have something that hit a lot of different styles of jazz, and then had these bigger connections. So, as a jazz composition teacher, a lot of one of the things I teach is this idea of the contrafact, and the idea that there are certain elements of jazz that influence the next generation, and then you put your own stamp upon it, and then there's all these you go down a well and you check out the music of Irene Higginbotham, for example. One of the people, Dorothy Fields is a lyricist, but a similar type of person to Gail Geldstein, who's a woman in a a very boys club kind of environment, who's incredibly talented, and it's only later that she gets her dues. And so that was one of the big seeds. I was also reading a book by an author named Thomas Brothers, really great author, called Louis Armstrong's New Orleans at the time, and just sort of painting the picture of what New Orleans, what the culture and people and the moment were like that could lead to someone like Louis Armstrong finding success. Someone, he's not originally from, or his family doesn't have deep roots to the history of New Orleans. Come from rural Louisiana, descendants of slaves. And it was this smaller migration before the Great Migration from rural agrarian settings into urban settings, and then they had a little anecdote in there about King Oliver, Joe Oliver, who I previously mentioned, was the man who invited Lewis to Chicago. There's a story that Joe Oliver was playing a concert when a fight broke out, and the police came in and arrested the band for riling up the audience with their jazz music. So that's why he left. One of many reasons he left New Orleans with his family. He had family to support. But the way that Joe Oliver and Louis Armstrong met was that Joe would give Louis Armstrong his case to carry for parades. And there's sort of this rite of passage because, like, when you're playing like this, you don't want to have a case over your shoulder. It messes up your breathing and all that. So, and like, it was a really beautiful kind of moment of mentoring. And just the thought entered my mind, well, like, we've all known pretty lousy mentors in our life, or people who like come into our lives seeming like they'll be fine, being like the mentor. And it was like, wouldn't it be funny if Lewis didn't know? And then that became sort of a seed. So from there, it's like, well, I want to also talk about fusion. I want to like talk about this whole connection. So that was always built in there. It's funny. Speaking of all this here, Chris Brunner, who did our covers. I'm not sure if you mentioned that all the covers are one large piece of art, one interconnected.
I don't. You know what?
I don't even think I clocked that.
Because
they came out so far apart.
That
No
I think
offense.
was somewhere that was. I think that was in. Now that you mentioned, that was in my notes for the intro episode. But
it's
I don't think
plainly
I
laid
said
out
it though.
as such in the trade.
I've
got my physical trade right here, and I see that the cover gallery in the back, they stitched them 2 and 2 and 2, but I don't think I just did the obvious next step and went like,
go cover to cover. Yeah,
that's all
Yeah.
6 lineup.
Which
And Rico
was
Renzi on the colors, right? On the covers.
Rico, Chris and Rico together. Sorry, Rico, I didn't mention that right away.
No. Oh, well, yeah.
They're amazing. And in fact, it's weird because we had every intention of releasing monthly. It was Ramon Perez who did the 4th issue, who for a variety of non-comics reasons was way behind. And there was even a moment where it's like with Kyle and me, it's like, can we handle a multi-month break like this? Kyle and I were talking through it. It's like, it's for Ramon Perez, dude. Yeah, of course we can. We can wait for Ramon Perez.
Yeah. He's so good.
And I gotta say, I'm sure non-comic reasons are the main reason, but also an incredibly difficult issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
like,
it's very dense.
The paneling, like the interview format, like trying to keep everything clear. Narratively, or at least as clear as the writer wants it to be, right? You're supposed to. I think Alex and I both said we had to reread that issue. Like as soon as we finished it, it was like, oh, now I know where it's going. Let me reread it.
Yeah.
Which is great value for the money, right?
Yeah, but that is I think by far the most kind of narratively from a storytelling structure. That's kind of the most experimental in terms of just how you read a comic book. So yeah, I mean, I can see why just from a comic reason why it might take someone as great as Ramon is a little while, but life happens, and so I guess that it explains why they're gaps happen. That delays happen. They're inevitable, unfortunately.
I think it actually, like, this might be cope. I'm willing to immediately start by saying this might be cope. But in a way, it kind of works with the narrative in a weird way, because, like, the whole point of the narrative is that there are these connections and then you lose track of them. And that, like, they're not obvious, Mm-hmm. Regarding the complexity of issue 4, I have to admit, like, the first draft of it was so was so complicated that we had two parallel narratives. One was just what's linearly happening in time, and then one was the way we were presenting that. And to really finesse it, I literally wrote out that linear script and chopped it up and did the William Burroughs thing essentially.
Little cut and paste.
Seeing ways of like, well, this moment ends with somebody doing this type of thing, so maybe that, yeah, and then like, so like that was definitely like one of the ones where thinking of Dylan Thomas or T.S. Eliot or stuff like Alan Moore, like that kind of stuff.
It takes all kinds. Yeah, my favorite was we had Pornsak Pishishoda on talking about the good Asian.
Oh hell yeah!
He plots in Microsoft Excel. He puts it in a spreadsheet and it's like, here's all the story beats. Got to make sure I circle back to everything, and that there's like
the wildest thing anyone's said.
Wild arc. I was like, as soon as he said it though, I was like, I get it. Like
that's so cool.
It's a way to say, here's these beats, here's where they pay off, here's where things land. Like it makes sense, and it's like if you say, I got 24 pages. Here's 24 column rows and 6 issues, and then you say like, okay, we're gonna color code these, and this is set up here and pays off over here. It's like I see it, but I'm also an Excel nerd, so
I'm afraid I'd hit like sort A to Z and ruin everything.
undo.
But it was very funny when issue 3 came out. I want to make sure I don't skip Diego, and I do want to get back to Chris because he's got a really interesting connection here. With Diego, like issue 3 is one of our more straight ahead issues. We do some formalist games going between. Diego is such a can flip through between styles so effortlessly, and trying to play with like more cartoony 40s and 50s golden age kind of presentations with like alternating that and like the middle American Norman Rockwell-y kind of stuff. And there was a couple people early on who were like, that was kind of a simple story. And I was like, just wait wait for issue 4. Yeah. It's coming, folks.
Yeah.
We have to have the balance here.
I mean, the simple, yes, but I think the emotion in that story is one, like, as a father, I had this resonance of like, I had some anxiety when my kid was on the way because I was like, well, look, I got a lot of hobbies. I like doing stuff, and I want to still care about the things I care about. And, the human heart expands, hopefully not physically, but literally. And it's like, oh, I can love this and this, and I don't resent having a kid like I was worried I might, because I don't get to play guitar as often as I used to, and little things like that. But then the genius of it, what I think turns it from like, okay, that's what I just described as a powerful emotion, but a simple story. But then giving it from the vantage point of the daughter, like trying to figure out, what's wrong with that. And also playing detective. I'm like, I think a simple story is underselling it, but I certainly understand why someone would read that after, one read through, and then, and then you really slap them around with issue 4.
Before I forget about Chris and Rico, Chris did the Lord's work with these 6 interconnected covers. Because like, talk about the gap in there, that was a way to visually represent what we're trying to do with the story, Have you guys ever read Promethea by Alan Moore?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, so like there's that one issue where they go through the whole Major Arcana of the Tarot, and like, I'm more brained. I love Alan Moore so much, and I like his
Alan Moore.
Yeah, right. Have you guys read Jerusalem? Have you guys
I have not.
Oh
No.
man, that's his a novel that he put out. It's a doorstop.
Okay.
And it's genius. I think everybody needs to be like forced to read this thing. It's so good. But anyway, that the way that they use the image there, it actually takes a lot of like processing and a lot of planning to figure out like how are you gonna have 6 images that work separately but also interconnectedly, and also like not commit copyright infringement because we're doing a variety of different images. We almost went to print with an actual copywritten champagne logo on the cover, and I was like, oh no, we will get sued. We cannot do that. But when we were first talking to Chris, he was like, Are you guys just asking me this because my grandpa's Danny Barker? And I was like, okay, first of all, we didn't know this, and second of all, if you guys don't know, Danny Barker is one of the most important banjo players in New Orleans.
Oh, wow.
Someone who like there's plaques to Danny Barker as you walk around. And a great author too. A great Black American music historian. And weirdly enough, like he's got his own fictionalized history of Storyville. So there was something, yeah, which is wild. So Chris, as he was talking to this, he's like, so I've been, I have my own work that I'm working on. So like I'm not going to do certain things. So that we actually made a couple edits to the script so that it wouldn't be too close to Danny
Oh,
Barker's
wow.
stories.
Wow.
If you guys haven't read those two, those are really fun. He structures the whole thing as an interview with an old musician who doesn't exist. Just really interesting, exciting narrative structures for something that ends up talking about old time jazz. And I feel like you guys have talked about Dixieland before. So Dixieland is the word is a popular word to describe that. I think most jazz fans would call that like trad jazz, traditional jazz, or
Okay.
early jazz.
Does that come from the original Dixieland, the name of the band, right?
Yeah, so the word Dixie comes from New Orleans because they had the French mint there. And if you had a $10 bill, it had D-I-X.
Yes, yeah.
It's a Dixie, right? And so there's this perverse romanticization of antebellum South in the teens and 20s, everything from Birth of a Nation to all these songs about the South,
Yeah.
And so yeah, like artists like the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which is led by a white trumpeter, Nick LaRocca. But again, it's there's nuance to it. He's an Italian American immigrant. I don't think he would have been considered white in his own lifetime,
Right.
at the beginning.
Yeah.
So there's that complication, but also he's kind of a piece of garbage. He was like ripping off other artists. The very first jazz record is the very first jazz lawsuit, because he wrote a tune called the Livery Stable Blues, which was simply stealing someone else's tune called the Barnyard Blues. And so what's so interesting looking at early jazz, to me at least, is that like you do get very interesting stories of people who are coming up with an art form, essentially. People who are figuring out what it means to entertain in a world where now you can like have world exposure. And people who are coming up with the technology. Something that we try to convey in this book is that we go from people playing in acoustic settings to live audiences and like before recording. We have recording in the second issue, and working to essentially the Johnny Carson show. Everybody in the world look at truly,
Yeah.
truly the world is that.
Well, I mean, one thing I want to be sure to ask about, is when we get to issue 5, the music critic.
Yes.
Which I like. I will admit to you as the writer, because of my turnaround on it, but when I saw this was like the direction we're going, like, oh, the music critic who like doesn't think he gets the new jazz or whatever, and then comes around on it, I was like, oh, that's kind of tropey. I don't think I'm gonna like it. It knocked my socks off, and I
Hey,
think
thanks.
it's now my favorite issue because one, I was like, they have set themselves up here as like, oh, here's this award-winning writer, and when at the end of the issue he inevitably writes, the writing better be so good I believe it. And it was. Like
Thank you.
his little article was fantastic. And
You would not believe the amount of times that I had to rewrite that thing.
oh, I think I would. I think I would believe it because I'd like you set the bar so high for yourself with who that character was. But there's also this like this sense of like as soon as something is defined, it's officially dead. It's like, like once you define it, everything that comes after the definition is like, the definition is, it's all set in stone now. Anything after this is like, is dead. And the fact that, our critic learns not just, he didn't just learn, I'm an old curmudgeon. Like, right? That's not an interesting lesson. Everyone's told that story. He's not the Ebenezer Scrooge of jazz. Um, he's he instead learns what the thing is by learning what it isn't. And I may have not said anything at all, or it might just all be tautological in nature.
No,
But
and like that's kind of HUD's whole character, you know. That's I think ultimately like we don't fully see his impact on the big story until the last page, or the last two
Yeah.
pages, excuse me, where they mention that like the whole reason why the Great Unknown is a band is because like they just happen to be holding the same magazine at the same time, you know. And
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
his contribution isn't like, oh, he's the genius writer who was able to figure out the deeper meaning. Like he you know, he had some trenchant insights, but the best insight he had was ripping off his ex-boyfriend, you know, sort of an Amiri Baraka stand-in, and ultimately like the last piece of the puzzle. You know, like that little thing here is like them being like, hey, remember how we met? Because we were just holding that magazine and like we just sort of hit it off from that, you know? And like that's honestly important. The Weather Report, sort of a model, one of the bands is a model for the Great Unknown. The name comes from Bob Dylan. None of the music they've ever done sounds anything remotely like Dylan. Dylan like has
right.
like zero influence, except he had this line, you know, you don't need a weatherman to tell you which way the wind is blowing. And somebody said like, well, we should be the Weather Report then. And then like that's, you know,
Yeah.
um, so
Different
that
ways,
issue,
different way you could inspire people and have an impact. Yeah, not maybe not in sound or in style, but yeah, just an idea.
yeah, for sure. You know, there's really this is another thing. Like I work with a lot of younger musicians, and I think if you're getting into music in the 21st century, like no one is surprised that the opportunities might not be as fruitful as they were at some point. You know, there was a period in the 1940s where the musicians union was so strong they took 2 years off from recording with major labels and working with PROs. Like it was just like the sense of solidarity. And and a lot of our teachers, at least my generations of teachers, came into different economic and business realities, which changes the art in some ways because, you know, I mean, heck, if you look at my discography, there's a whole bunch of years in the middle where I wasn't doing much because I was just working. I was trying to get to the next point so I could do something else. You know, and thankfully, like things are moving in the last, you know, decade or so, but like there was a real fallow period there, and that was really tough. And so a lot of students still see that kind of thing. And so like the truth though is that like it's always kind of been like this, you know, that there have been moments of explosive development. You know, the fact that like Louis Armstrong's success is in many parts because he's, in addition to being a genius, he was also a genius who was around when recording went from an analog to an electronic process. You could record in higher fidelity, and then you could make a motion picture with sound. You know, he is the a genius many times over, but just happened to be like lining up in perfect synchronicity with the technology. Duke Ellington is a brilliant composer who also like was able to uh, uh, document some of these larger scale compositions through long playing LPs in ways that, you know, other composers didn't quite have the chance or the moment of it. And so you really don't know. And that's what I was really trying to convey through this. It takes many different types of people, and it takes all sorts of efforts. In ways that we just literally cannot understand it. It's hubris to even try to do so. You just got to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
We should say that issue 5 drawn Junie Ba, which you know, he's someone whose art I love and have seen,
Amazing.
but it
Who else could
on
do
the
an
so,
acid trip like that?
we said on the surface it seems such a radical departure from, I mean, especially what you had just seen in issue 4 with what Ramona done with these kind of these really kind of blue cold tones, kind of depict, you know, fitting narratively. But then when you get into the story and you realize like just the kind of character that Hudson is, and you're like, oh right, if he's going to be tripping on acid in the story, then you might as well have an artist that can just draw that just kind of so fluidly and just be in his style and have it not feel weird, because like that's like Junie has such a specific style to his art,
Oh, for
that
sure.
that once you're in it, like, all right, this makes perfect sense. As a reader, you understand everything about Hudson in this time period just from seeing character design and all, and just looking at the environment, and it's almost like the way he sees the world. You're just there. It fits perfectly.
And like Judy was so good at like just like setting a scene and just like really filling it with I mean he does this in everything, but like when we were first talking to Judy, he had just put out, you guys read his book Jalea at all? Or, I
I've
think
not
it's
read that. No, I did read
it,
his recent work at DC, The Boy Wonder, the
oh
Robin
yeah,
story
so
he did,
good.
which
Man,
is so
he's
cool,
so
so cool.
talented. I loved him.
Yeah.
Jalea is based. He's from Senegal originally, and so it takes all this West African mythological folklore and stories, and sort of like um, uh, recontextualizes it, and like as like such a like deep cultural inflection to it, you know, that like when we were talking, I was like, would this be something you'd be interested in? Because like we think you'd be perfect, but we know like you're doing this and Monkey Meat, and
Yeah.
he's got this book coming out based on Erlkönig, the Goethe poem.
Oh
Uh,
wow.
I know the guy's so
Okay.
heavy. Um, and like man, the fact we were able to like like he's blown up. He's so booked right now that like
Yeah.
man, we really lucked out. Like
You
getting
got him
right
just
in
before.
there.
You got him just before. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And he here talking about secret things to pick up in the next reread. He put in I think about a half dozen Muppets references. He's like, I like the Muppets. And so like and he yeah, it's great. He's so great.
That's fantastic. That is awesome. That is awesome. So I
Uh
guess
yeah.
if you have any more to say about five, I was going to go into issue six here by Toby
Yeah.
Cypress, and I think the one thing I wanted to say here, because so at the end of five, if had been reading this and you hadn't quite picked up on all kind of the threads there, as you present Hudson's article, you kind of have that montage and you start seeing where the characters are in what were we 1960 or
It
at
was
that
68,
moment, yeah, in 68. So you start seeing those threads there, and they all kind of coalesce. Maybe not physically, but the storylines all kind of come together in character and theme and all that in issue six. And I was telling Mike, this kind of narrative anthology structure, when you have these loose ties, not direct characters, but loose themes. It's one of my favorite storytelling structures, and I specifically love
yeah.
it in comics. Like my favorite comics of all time are all essentially anthologies, where it's like Sandman, Criminal, Astro
Sure.
City, Fables. Like they're all these big sprawling
Are
books
you a
where
Seven Soldiers fan at all?
I have read it, not as big as much of that one, but that structure is there though, and so I love it when you get to the end and you see all these ties. As a reader, you get them. But what I loved about what you guys did here was that it was specific, that the characters understood the threads. And going back to what you said at the very beginning about that article that Herbie Hancock wrote, the idea
Yeah,
of
yeah.
passing down to the next generation. I love that it was Barry, the saxophonist, that him and Alice were there talking, and they were discovering, and he in the story was able to track back. Well, my mentor had this song, and he got it from his mentor, working all, and we take it all the way back to Ace Stewart in the first issue. And like it seemed important for you guys to express that the musicians, your characters, understood the threat. So it wasn't just for the audience, but there was
Yeah.
a narrative aspect that it was important for him, because I specifically that issue, Barry had kind of lost his way, doing the disco thing, whatever, musically he was lost, and finding this thread all the way back kind of in a way rejuvenated him. So it was narratively important, it was character important, and if you're, as a reader, you see those threads, you get that kind of Easter egg there. And I love that you made it important to the characters, that it was that understanding the history and understanding what came before, and how everything that was built on going back 60 years in your book led to that moment. I thought that was really fulfilling, and kind of getting to that end, I thought was really, really cool.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Barry Newark actually was my way of like not, there's like Kevlar and Clay, like you can kind of say like oh, this is our Schuster and Siegel moment, this is our Cane and Finger moment. or there's some characters that are more loose, more directly connected to like you know. So
I was going to ask about that later. If each issue had a either direct or indirect for a specific artist, or if you were just taking ideas from the time. But yeah, we can come back to that. So, but yeah,
for sure, yeah, okay.
so but yeah, so you can continue on what you were saying here that with Barry.
Oh, I was gonna say, you know, since Wayne Shorter was one of the authors of that, and Wayne Shorter is was my hero. I actually lucked out. I was the last guest in line for his last Chicago show right before he passed.
Oh wow!
And we had like a really it was one of those moments that'll just like stick with me forever. You know, it meant a lot. And so he's passed shortly after that, like I mentioned, and his even though the character is not fully Wayne Shorter. Wayne Shorter's nickname growing up was the Newark Flash. He grew up in Newark, New Jersey, and so I was like, "Oh, Barry Newark, we'll put that in there." And you know, it's like a way to connect that there. So,
little nod, that's nice.
yeah, you know, not everybody is one thing, and it really is not, you know, a one-to-one. But
I would imagine it's not. But yeah, it seemed like that there were enough specifics that it was like, well, I've heard about this story about this artist, and you take that and you take another story. It seemed like there was either amalgamation, or maybe did you start at each issue with kind of like here's the type of story we want to tell for this era, and did you have artists in mind when you were at least building your main characters?
Yeah, there were definitely like within the first issue, so much of the importance was like, how do you make this vibrant? How do you make this like not a textbook? You know, because yeah, I come from academia, and like there is a way to speak. You know, there is a language to describe what's going on very frequently, and that has value. But in terms of storytelling, like I was like, I really wanted to present something that was not about, that didn't have this like weight of obligation to it. You know, there was a movie a while back about Buddy Bolden. If you guys don't know Buddy. Do you guys know who Buddy Bolden is by any chance?
I do not.
But Buddy Bolden is this fascinating character that Danny Barker, the subject of one of Danny Barker's writings. And he was a very popular, very influential trumpeter in New Orleans before sound recording. Who then had a mental break essentially and was institutionalized. And even though he died during the era of sound recording, he died, I believe, in 31 around there. Just not a single note of his music's ever been recorded. And so like there's a movie that came out about that, and it, you know, really a passion project, beautiful music. Wynton Marsalis sort of you know, played the buddy part. You know, so that's fantastic, but there's this weight to it of like, here's an important thing you need to know. Here's an important artist, and there, you know, he is an important artist, but like I feel that can sometimes bog down story. You know, like in story sometimes like the way we can empathize with other people, or we can get into like other people's lives and other people's experiences, is often predicated on an emotional connection of some sort, you know? And stories are just such a beautiful way of conveying that. And jazz is just filled with these brilliant, fascinating people who are unburdened from any sort of expectation of what that looks like. You know, they were able to sort of shape their artistry. You know, one of the comps for Jack in the first issue is Jelly Roll Morton. Jelly Roll Morton is a guy who like he's got these wonderful interviews with Alan Lomax from the Library of Congress, and gets into not just the music and the style, but also talks about like, yeah, I never wear symmetrical clothes because if you wear symmetrical clothes, you'll get the evil eye. And in the script, I originally had this description of like, this is what Jelly Roll said the coolest guys were in New Orleans. And everybody was like, this is insane. And if we put this in the book, people will think that like this is a clown person. And it's like, I don't know, that's what Jelly Roll said, man. You know, like he said you wore red and black alternating. He was there, yeah. Crossed over and there's a pin here, you know? And
yeah, so, you might have to like open the issue with the quote from Jelly Roll.
Yeah, right.
In order
need some more
to,
context.
Buy yourself the freedom to do that.
And so like the big thing is like I wanted to make sure that whether or not there was an individual character, like so, like I've mentioned, Irene Higginbotham and Dorothy Fields. The third issue, there's so much to talk about Kansas City jazz and like that sort of Benny Moten, Count Basie, and Lester Young and the musicians in that scene. But a lot of that was there's a lot of connection to my own personal life in that too. Like my parents also worked alternating shifts, to afford childcare essentially, and my dad was a bass player. He actually did do that thing that happens in the story where he took a gig on his break, and
Yeah.
so like there's bastions of that, but that was one of the things like we wanted to make sure we got this really anchored in verisimilitude, and so with that like something that I really enjoyed in the process or appreciated, is like stuff like talking about a night job. Oh, okay. Well, my dad was a security guard. Well, an African American gentleman in 1940 couldn't have that job.
Mhm.
There were certain jobs that one could do and one could not do, and so like trying to contextualize some of the racial realities of like, or another thing, I grew up in the suburbs with Kyle, Lockport, Illinois. And like, I was like, well, where was the predominant African American suburb of Kansas City in the 1940s? And the answer is the institution of suburbs were sort of invented to create, segregation in a de jure, de facto kind of way, excuse me. Um, and so that was something that was really interesting going through the process of uh, and I don't know. I feel that there's a synchronicity with the narrative in that it's about um, uh, reflecting on how the past is a foreign land. It's very similar in many ways, but there's underpinnings that are you might not expect differences.
Mhm. Sure.
And then from there with issue 4, like I wanted to contextualize. Like I feel like there's so many uh, preconceptions about what drug use was in jazz. That it was like this like cool kids kind of thing. But like Charlie Parker, who died at the age of 35 from a life of heroin addiction. Hey, there we go.
No, no, when
Saxophone
you,
fan.
well, no, well, yeah, yeah, my first jazz teacher, my first music teacher on saxophone was a Charlie Parker fan, so I like listened to him. But when you get to that part in the episode, when I was reading that, I was like, this Dorian character, like obviously Charlie Parker had a lot more recordings than that, but I was like, this feels Charlie Parker coded in terms of the idea of so it's like I picked up on that at least because there's a sense of he died in his 30s and what the story was the autopsy
Yeah.
they misaged him thinking he was someone like in his 50s or 60s because his body was just so wrecked.
Absolutely. And like he didn't start using heroin until after a car accident where he wasn't able to get pain medication essentially. And there's a lot of stories like that. Eric Dolphy is someone who was diabetic, had a diabetic episode, went to the hospital and they just presumed he was a drug addict. He was a teetotaler. He didn't even drink. And like so for that starting with like and then also someone like Clifford Brown who died at the age of 24, 25, something like that, incredibly young, who is just like so insanely talented, that like they've released records that like are of such abysmal quality because it's like we've got another Clifford Brown recording. You can hear him live at the Beehive in 1955.
It's all we have, right? So we got to put it
That's
out.
it,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and it's like there's these like little miracles that they exist. And for that, like once we started heading that direction, I was like, well, I'd love to make a list. I literally made a list of like jazz musicians who died under the age of 50. How'd they do it? In that era.
Mhm.
You start going through it. It's like, yeah, there's different medical issues. There's different issues of like Lester Young, for example. We mentioned with Kansas City connection. When he got drafted, he got busted for weed. And the pain of doing hard labor for 1 year in a prison essentially like drove him to self-medicate, and so like try to find a way to take elements from a lot of those stories and fold them together in terms of injustice, police brutality. And there's this relationship I should mention here. Police brutality. Miles Davis famously got punched in the throat outside of a club in 1959.
Mhm.
But also there's a connection with Thelonious Monk and Bud Powell. both great bebop pianists. Thelonious Monk, um, kind of famous. There's a couple documentaries about Thelonious Monk, and he's a,
Yeah.
you know, um,
I love Monk. Yeah, he's one of those names I think even like casual music fans probably know the name.
yeah.
I mean, yeah. So
And Bud Powell might not be as famous, but I think the movie Round Midnight has just been re-released, the Bernard Tavernier movie, and that's based on the lives of Lester Young and Bud Powell, sort of another project in a similar vein, but it's another one about the death of jazz. So I really didn't want to, go in that way.
Yeah.
Um, but with that, like Bud Powell was someone who was Thelonious Monk was his mentor. And the story goes in Philadelphia, plainclothes police officers tried busting Thelonious Monk. This is an era when the Department of Prohibition was trying to justify its existence by becoming the Department of Narcotics. Marijuana wasn't illegal until the 40s, I think. So like
that sounds about right. That sounds about right. Somewhere in there.
they were deliberately trying to heighten reefer madness, and talk about the risks of that. And then like Henry Anslinger, who was head of the Department of Narcotics, like is on record being like, we need to stop African American, well, in more colorful terms, we need to stop African Americans from thinking they're as good as everyone else by taking them down a couple pegs. This is all in quotations. Please do not take me out of context, anybody in the future. Um, but and so with that, when Bud Powell saw Thelonious Monk being attacked by these cops, he went to save him, and the police hit him so hard it fractured his skull. He had brain injuries for the rest of his life, and so later Thelonious Monk got in trouble with the police for possession of narcotics. It was heroin in his trunk, and everybody said the same thing: Monk doesn't use heroin. Why does he have that? And the thought was that maybe he had taken the fall for Bud Powell, who had helped him out so much. So that was definitely part of this, the thought too. Like, how do you kind of set up something that's separate but sort of informed by that idea of the honestly the love that you get when working with a fellow artist live.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
very deep thing.
I mean, you mean I think you kind of explain it, elucidate that you get that in the issue when Dorian and the other characters, Roy, I think it was, when they get busted. It's like, well, Dorian will take the fall because he has a clean record, so clearly,
Yeah.
the system will go easy on him, because yeah, he doesn't have a record, never, no history or anything like that,
And then mandatory minimums.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and just gets absolutely crushed by that. So, kind of that idea of, well, yeah, the system will save us, except that doesn't work when the system is just literally rigged against you. But
100%,
the thought of it being there, showing that, and I guess knowing that things like that were obviously happening, but to have specific examples of it from the jazz industry and musicians like that. Yeah, it's heartbreaking, but it's also like, I mean, that's our history. Like that's what was happening there, and it just didn't matter if you were a jazz musician or what. It just, that's how society was set up. And yeah, it's terrible, but seeing that depicted there and I guess kind of shining a light on that, I think is again, I think it's admirable and commendable to try and work those really complex ideas and kind of put it into like a couple of panels, on the page here to show that this is just representative of the experience of so many people at that time.
And so a lot of these issues have a secondary game that's going on. So we got the Wizard of Oz. The first issue is a name game, essentially. Everybody's got a second name or a fake name or and which ends up being about the whole thing, essentially. It's about names and how the Ace High becomes Ace I, which becomes Ace I Berry, which it has all these layers and Berry is Berry, and there's so many things going on. So that's the first issue. The second issue is the Wizard of Oz kind of thing. The third issue, we go between the Golden Age and more realistic depiction. Naturalistic, I guess, is a better way to put that.
Okay, sure, yeah.
For this one, right out of the gate, one thing we wanted to do, and I'm not sure if you guys have talked about this yet or not. we wanted to use the album covers of Blue Note records in the actual images.
Oh, wow.
So they're all pastiches and parodies, just in case Blue Note's lawyers hear this. That's true. Like we literally have a document, the don't get sued document, where we're like, is each one of these is legally distinct in a way that we can argue? Yes, we're
Isn't
good.
getting sued the most jazz thing you can do?
It really is from the beginning.
It's counterfactual, right? That's what you got to say, right?
Yeah, exactly. But there's about 30 of them.
Oh,
Maybe up to
wow.
35.
Wow.
Little references. So if you look at the first page, on the floppies you'll notice in the the trade collection, or the first panel is blank, because we got rid of all of the credits for the individual issues. But in the original, it was set up like something else, the Cannonball Adderley record. And then panel 2 is the back of Ornette Coleman's New York Is Now. So when we say New York, it's like New York is now. It's like, so there's that level to it. The third one is Herbie Hancock's Inventions of Dimensions. Um, and then
So
if
what you're
you
saying
turn
is I got to Google image search all the Blue Note albums and then have that next to me
I
as
have never taken so many notes during a podcast interview.
Yeah, so I got to go
it's
back through and
obnoxious
look at
'cause I have a mechanical
every page,
keyboard.
every panel, and line it up with. You got to scroll through.
There was-
Because I'll definitely do that now. That
a saint on TikTok. When TikTok was going, I was frantically looking like, is it still out there? And maybe it is. I don't know where it is right now, but there's a guy on TikTok who like got maybe 90% of them. You know,
whoa.
and like,
Cliff Notes version. All right, there we go.
yeah, and so it's stuff like even the club name is called Fun City. The reason we did that is the F and the C are burnt out, and there's an album cover Unity with Larry Young, and like that's what that looks like. So like they're all over the darn place, and so that was the game of that one.
I got to go hunt for that now. Definitely. Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
I'm like,
That's
I just opened
that's
a tab
incredible.
to Google
Yeah.
and see the TikTok because I think it's all available on the web now. But, well, we've blown right past the hour mark, so I want to honor your time. I do have more questions. It sounds like Alex definitely does.
Well,
Let's go for it. If you guys have
I'm
nothing to
curious.
do-
Let's finish this up here in terms of we've gone through 4 issues now, kind of the themes going into 5 and 6 now. Yeah, if you want to keep kind of what the background issue was on each of those.
All right, I just wanted to give him an out time wise.
Well, thank you. No, I appreciate, you guys are very, very polite, but this is great. I love
Well,
talking.
we're all Midwestern, so
Yeah.
we have to be polite, but also too kind to back out if we're busy. So,
So yeah,
there's-
so issue 5. Yeah.
There's a not very strict sort of arc structure a little bit in the way we organize this. Not too much, but like the idea that the first issue is sort of a kid figuring out what it means, literally. Which is a quotation from the old song, "Do you know what it means to miss New Orleans, to miss it both night and day?" All of the titles have song connections. Sorry, but I Can't Take You is going to Chicago. Sorry, but I Can't Take You, the Chicago Blues. Casey Blues is a Charlie Parker song. Blue Notes is just because of Blue Note Records.
That makes sense now. Yeah.
And Seeking/Secrets are the title of 2 LA free jazz records. And then The Great Unknown is just sort of like we've every story at some point touches on the fact that like so much of this is about not knowing, the artistry of it. So, the second issue. So if we talk about how this works, if the beginning and the end kind of are about what it means, we wanted to have inversions essentially, or reflections. So like if Gail Geldstein is someone who's like works so hard to do everything right and it just doesn't work out because of society and history and luck, essentially, then what's the opposite of that? Someone who has done very, very little right and is just a cloud chasing son of a bitch. And so that was our Hudson Lowell. Hudson for all the rich people in the Hudson Bay, Lowell because it's a really a hoity-toity Massachusetts suburb, and so it's like, he's got a blue blood in his name, he's got the first initial no one says, and sort of like you know, that's one thing where like, how many people inspire these stories? Like, I hate to say it, but so many of these stories are like, what if this guy was shitty? You know,
Yeah.
what
What if
if
this person
Norman
was bad?
Mailer
What's the
was a
worst version of
total
this? For yeah,
yeah, right. You know, and someone's like, it's playing with that like gonzo journalist, you know, Hunter S.
yeah,
Thompson, Norman
clearly,
Mailer,
yeah,
Ned
definitely.
Rorem, those types of writers.
Mhm.
Um, and that's why we ended up like, man, you should have seen how many times I rewrote that last thing because like what I would keep reading and it was like the bar is higher than this. Got to keep going. Got to tighten this up. Got to be better with the prose. Um, and so we always wanted this one to be a little bit more comedic, you know, especially coming after like something that's more tragic, you
Mhm.
know, something that has like a lot of weight and like is about systemic issues um and sort of playing with free jazz. It's a little hack to just say you don't like free jazz in general, I guess, but I also know a lot of people kind of don't have an in on it, you know? And I also kind of thought that the in that is presented frequently, that like jazz is a music of revolution and this is music that is being revolutionary. It's like, well, in many ways, but it's not just like being a political tool, you know? Like I think a lot of artists are that. They are creating, they are working with materials and history, and they're part of a tradition that's reflecting on the artists that came before them. And that's can be kind of tricky in any sort of avant-garde art. Um, and so the idea of this one would be to have Hudson figure it out, and then his final solution would be completely wrong, just like not get it, and he has to be told the answer. And like even his efforts are like, well, I'm just gonna get stoned and you know go to an orgy, and you know he really never does the work. He never really learns anything, but he has a role to play within it, and he
Mhm.
does. Uh, he can write, you know. And I think we've all probably met people like that, you know.
Sure, yeah,
Yeah.
he doesn't seem to have many or any redeeming qualities, except he is clearly a good journalist. He clearly does that thing well.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah,
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 yeah. Just
yeah,
not an esthetician here. You know, it doesn't have
yeah.
a philosophical underpinning for it.
Mhm.
Um, his cat is named Wandishi, which was the name that Herbie Hancock took in his sextant group, or I guess Mwandishi is what they call it. It's
Yeah.
a Swahili word that means composer.
Okay,
Um,
okay.
and so the idea behind that is hopefully early on you can sort of peg that like it is not his cat.
Well,
That
yes,
like
yeah.
that you know it's his boyfriend from the previous issue. No, they're sort of peppered in the back of the issue before.
Yeah, that
You know?
that's one of those things that like you see him in both the interview portion of four, and he's in line outside of one of the clubs as well, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, so like
absolutely.
yeah, were those notes you guys gave to the artist in terms of like this character is going to recur,
Yeah.
and like obviously you're going to draw him at a different time in his life, but were those little things you knew you had to drop in terms of how that connective tissue was going to work? Like in this scene, we need to have this kind of thing, or was it more just like it'd be cool if it were here?
You know what? What's really great is you know, as you guys have mentioned before, like the team really ties things together, and like the art really tells the story in ways that the words can't. And so like we did have a lot of those connections in the script originally, and we really had the time to like really pace it out and figure out like what's the most we can make these connections without it being too ham-fisted, without it being too confusing, but like specifically for issue four, it was Ramon who was like, let's have him look kind of similar to issue five, a little bit more so. Because the original idea that Kyle and I were bouncing was that like he'll be clean cut and he'll be like a beatnik. He talks like a beatnik, you know. He's the
Mhm.
he's the only guy who talks like that
Mhm.
in the whole series, you know, in terms of like hep cat jazz talk. Jazz musicians talk like people, and he's like, yeah, daddy, oh, ring a ding ding.
Yeah.
Um, but um, but Ramon was like, let's have him be a little bit more disheveled just from the very beginning. You know, he's getting away with it, but like there's a way to have that connection there. And so that way, like we were hoping, I know that all these connections aren't maybe immediately picked out, you know, or aren't, you know, and like I'm hoping that someone can appreciate reading this book and like in the same way that like you appreciate listening to jazz or learning about jazz. So much of this is sort of based on that experience of like issue 4 was honestly less inspired by Dr. Manhattan and more inspired by like how you learn about a guy. You hear Clifford Brown play Cherokee, and you're like, wow, that guy's amazing. And then somebody says, yeah, he got in a car accident before that, before he died in a car accident. And now you're talking about the beginning of his career and end of his career concurrently. And so those characters showing up in there, like that was we like so many of the artists had like interesting ways to contextualize and connect this. And what was interesting is they didn't finish in chronological order. Five
That
and
was a
six were
question.
done.
That was a question I had later on here, because I was wondering about that specifically because obviously before we started talking, wondering about the delays and in terms
Yeah.
of what that gap was, and that if it was on the artist side that specifically you said it was Ramon, well then you already had scripts out to Junie and to
Yeah.
Toby that like those came in and maybe those got to Igor Monti, the colorist, before. And so yeah, if things when I was curious, it sounds like it was. And so like how did that, do you know how that affected things in terms of what the final product was? Like you
So
were seeing
yeah.
pages from 5 and 6 before 4 was done.
So for example, so there's this game of like if you have 6 different artists, like who gets to design the character? You know? Is it the guy who gets to spend all of his time drawing them or the first guy to get to do it? And essentially we were like, you know, this is the order it's coming out. Like, if you maybe you should do this character. But there was a couple of cases. So like, for example, Barry Newark, where like, um, he first shows up in issue 4,
Mhm.
but he shows up at the end of issue 5. And 5 was all done except for the panels where Barry was in.
Oh,
Like it was like Barry goes here. Let's see what Ramon comes up with. And then when it became very obvious that Ramon wasn't going to get a chance to do Barry, Toby's like, I'm ready. And so I was like, yeah, go. And so like here's the kind of description we're thinking of. And so and with Toby's art, Toby is fantastic at finding a way to convey these characters in like very exaggerated kind of ways. And for a
yeah.
story that's like very internalized and very much about a guy who's like sort of questioning his thing. Like um he was really smart in like coming up with like a character that could have a variety of different faces essentially. There's a lot of flexibility in the faces, but also like his big influence for the backgrounds that he and Igor worked out were later Warner Brothers cartoons. The Looney Tunes. If you look at the coloring, there's a lot of pinks, there's a lot of like flats, there's a lot of like,
Okay.
and it was just like, yeah, how do we make this more dramatic as a comic? How do we make this like vivid in the comic idiom in a way that like it doesn't just become some sort of dour internal struggle? So all that said, so now Toby in issue 6 had Barry, and we're like, yeah, this is kind of what he looks like, Judy. This is Barry. And then then we sent it to Ramon, so it actually went 654 in
Wow.
a way that yeah. So um, we essentially well, 5 was ready to go very quickly. Judy's a very fast, very efficient artist. Toby, once he realized he had more runway, was like, okay, well, let me know when you need me because I've got other projects. I believe this is how it played out. And then it also gave him time to like really develop like some of these more complicated uh, pages later. I say complicated, but he doesn't make them look complicated. Hopefully, they don't read as complicated. But one of the games of issue 6 is we are playing the deep cuts project through different cities on one page.
Yeah, you had those
Yeah,
like 4 panel time
yeah,
lapse things.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like as we go around the world, it's like, well, we never going to talk about. Well, now this is our time. We're going to talk about jazz in France. We're going to talk about how Django, essentially like some the jazz in France. A lot of the musicians were Roma, or people who might not have been working class people, musicians who synthesized what was going on with Black American musicians and sort of fold that into their language. So guys like Django Reinhardt or Stefan Grappelli. Django actually burned his left hand in a fire. So if you ever look at pictures of it, he actually has some fingers sort of fused together. If you know what Django's playing, he's an unbelievable musician. And so like how do we fit that into 4 panels? And how do we like convey that in an economic kind of way, talking about just getting that sort of wave effect of going back in time. And when we do Brazil, it starts with slaves doing capoeira, playing with the berimbau, going through the revolution in the 60s, the military junta, building the favelas, building Christ the Redentor on top of Corcovado. And then New Orleans, we've kind of already done that, but we do it through the lens of in real life Louis Armstrong Park. At one point, I was like, should we call it like Ace Stewart Park?
Oh yeah.
I was like, no, that's too neat. What are you doing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So one thing I mentioned talking about Cavalier and Clay, early on, Kyle was like, oh, I want to make sure that this exists in the same world as real jazz. And I was like, well, the game we're kind of playing, it would defeat it because, like, like this guy has Louis Armstrong's or a variation on Louis Armstrong's origin story. And Cavalier and Clay, like Cavalier and Clay aren't like, oh, also here's Jack Kirby,
Yeah.
And so I think we had our cake and ate it too. Because I think by the end, like to this day, Kyle's like, yeah, Charlie Parker's there. You just don't see him. And I'm like,
yeah,
no, it's.
But but also like in Cavalier and Clay,
but he could be.
They read Batman.
Yeah,
that's fair. Yeah, I forgot about that. Well,
yeah, they were like, well, Batman's an orphan. His parents died, so we got the great escapist has to do something. So it's like they play with that line a lot, even though it was like there's no Stan Lee in this world, but there is a Batman. And it's like, okay.
Yeah, so there may not be a Kirby, but
the thing is,
if something's a good, Captain America,
yeah, if something's good, you play along.
Yeah.
And I think what you were saying about discovering like the backstories of these like jazz musicians, it all starts with the first experience, which is listening, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what this book does really well. Is it reads? It's a great comic book. You can just read it as a comic and appreciate it, but then you start scratching away at these things and you're like, oh wait, am I is that referencing this? Is this referencing this? And now I've learned that it's just a bottomless well of references and meta things, and it's just like, oh my gosh,
this is a deep rabbit hole we could fall down. Mike,
cemented itself as one of my favorites. In fact, I'm reluctant to ask. I'm reluctant to ask because this is one of my headcanon things. But the words on the final page are very famous words from one of our favorite shows, The West Wing.
Oh,
where it says, "What's next?" That was like the refrain for all the characters. It started at the end of the pilot episode. They say, "What's next?" I
hate to say that that's just a coincidence. I've never seen.
I know. I figured it was. I was like,
I'm so sorry.
If it were. I was like, no, it just would have been the ultimate like Easter egg for me, but it works perfecly.
This is how pat we were formally at first. Is I tried to literally write the last dialogue backwards in the beginning. So in the original version of the script had the bouncer, when he plays at the window, he goes, "Oh, what's next?" And he walked up to it. So it was going to be the first words and the last words. And by the way, it's like, this is too neat. We're being too precious with this. We got to tell a story.
Trying to be too clever with it, right there.
Yeah, exactly. So that was really I was trying to get going there.
Well, so I have one request of you,
please.
It's something that I was thinking would probably be in the trade paperback. So maybe if there's ever a deluxe hardcover edition, or if you just want to release it on your social media.
We're making a record, so that's not beyond the pale.
I was like, well, okay, well, so an original record is next level. I was going to say one of my favorite things any creator's ever done was every issue of Royal City, Jeff Lemire had a like mixtape written in the back of each one that was like, here's your listening companion for this issue. And I was like, if any book begged for that, it's Deep Cuts.
We do have that on Spotify from when we were releasing it.
Damn. All right, we'll link to that in our episode description.
Definitely.
Yes, let me get all those for you.
And please tell me that you included some of your own music in those playlists.
Not on that, because I'm putting.
Well, then we'll stick that in the description.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you'll get half a penny for it, but
you know what? I take that back because I did include. Do you guys know about I'm Just Here for the Music? Do you know we recorded that?
Oh, did you? No.
I mean, that's not one of the sheet music in the back, is it?
No,
No.
That's the song.
I know that's the name
of
of the song, right?
Yeah.
So
it's like the lyrics are written on the train.
Yeah,
that's the one. Yeah. So every song from the book we wrote. I
Right.
wrote
Oh,
every single. So
Oh,
that's
wow.
what we what the album's going to be is I've got the song that they march to in the beginning, and then I'm just here for the music. I'll pop this into the chat for you here.
I'm gonna
Um,
spend way too much money on the vinyl
well,
pressing
thank you.
of this
Oh
album.
gosh, golly,
Yeah,
I'm eating food tonight. Um,
yeah. No, I mean, I like this is one of my favorite things. There was another Jeff Lemire Secret Path that had a vinyl album companion that you're supposed to put on the record and read at the pace of the. So it's like this is like my two favorite things colliding are comics and music. So
well, and the first thing I ever did for Image was the soundtrack for the Cowl called the Cowl Sessions. Excuse me. So I'm not sure if you guys have heard that one yet, but
I haven't. No,
oh gosh, I've got to send that to you. So that was the first like
I
comics
found it.
work that
Yeah.
Kyle ever hooked me up with there. Essentially, we had a soundtrack to Cowl called the Cowl Sessions.
Well, here I am making a request for something that already exists, which is
or will
more
exist here in the
research.
future so shortly.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
so the thing I've actually had it's been a very wonderfully busy year. And so like it just sort of hit me like, oh God, I literally am required by the grant to have a finished record by December 31st, 2025. So it's like, oh God, I gotta go. So we literally are recording from a brass band to this Broadway show tune that we got recorded here. To excuse me, a big band blues number, more like the bassy Ellington kind of milieu. A bebop. We have a Berry. Actually, the music for a Berry is in the comic.
Yeah,
So,
I saw that.
so when he looks at it, that's actually the song we're doing.
Oh,
And
excellent. Wow.
and yeah, so we go from that to a free jazz thing that sort of we have like a little scene in the middle, which is what Adler's bebop sounded like before it goes into this free jazz sound. And then closing out with our fake Steely Dan thing. The three from Yokohama, by the way, the reason why the three is either two or like seven people is because they're named after a marital device in a William Burroughs Naked Lunch. The Steely Dan 3 from Yokohama is the name of the. So the Steely Dan got their name that way. We just took the back half instead of the front
Oh
half.
my
That's
gosh.
fantastic. That's
Uh,
fantastic.
And so
Oh,
the
man.
solo that he plays to the original version, Toby had giant steps. He just had the sheet music for giant steps. I'm like, that's cute. Every jazz musician's gonna know that's giant steps instantly. I was like,
Yeah.
wait a second. And so wrote the song and then wrote what the tenor solo would sound like.
Ah,
And
Oh,
so
nice. That's
so
a
when the album comes out, that will be the tenor solo.
oh,
yeah. That's a
excellent.
pretty
That's
great
cool.
workaround for an artist, and then and then to have it become actual music. Yeah, this is just like this is the comic and music nerds like ultimate dream project.
Oh,
Like it just keeps
been such a
expanding
blessing.
and getting better.
Yeah.
And by the way, there's several decades unaccounted for. Is there any
Truly.
chance of a follow-up series?
Yeah, I was going to say the end of the trade says end of side A,
Yes.
Right.
which would imply there's a side B. So is
But I would
there
imagine
any?
side B would also be a complete standalone piece.
Well, I'm thankful for people like you who are reading so attentively and spending the time on it. Like I truly thank you, because this is something we care a lot about, and also like understand like. I'm very thankful that Kyle and Eric and all these artists were willing to spend so much time, effort, and energy on something that like, it'll never sell as much as a Smurfs reboot.
Sure.
Like whatever IP reboot number one is going to be have a wider audience than hey guys, it's April 1917.
Right. Oh yeah. No
Oh,
doubt about that.
I
Yeah,
forgot,
you got
by
to
the
pay
way,
the bills.
April 1917 is both the year that the first jazz record was recorded in upstate New York by the original Dixieland Jazz Band, but also the month, excuse me. It's also the month that America joined World War One. So it's also like this like moment of like explosive change in the world. So that's why it begins in April 19. That's why we specified April.
Yeah. Wow.
I think that makes sense also with the idea of the soldiers and things like that that you see in the
Yeah.
first. Okay, yeah. Okay.
They actually did cancel one of the few historical liberties we took was they canceled Mardi Gras in 1918 because of World War One. They just didn't know it by April. We just made it a little
Oh.
neater. But that's a real parade. If you look up the World War I parade of 1917 in New Orleans, like that's a real parade that actually
Oh,
did
wow.
happen. So
I think there's more rabbit holes to fall down now. Like there are all kinds of stuff that be busy with
Some
now.
kid's gonna get a PhD writing a dissertation just dissecting this book.
oh, that's very kind of
So,
you guys. Thanks so much.
Yeah, do we get does this count as like college credit? Can
I think
I,
this
is
can I
an audit.
retroactively get
No,
a
this
get,
is
get a
an
little bit
audit.
here?
Yeah.
I now have a minor in
Jazz studies. Yeah.
something. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. That
But
is
it's a
awesome.
great return for I guess all three of us back to high school jazz class. Do you have a old a music teacher that you want to shout out as getting you started on your journey?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. Let's
I
just
guess
start.
whoever your band director was with Kyle.
You know what? I'm going to say Karen Fannin is the one I want to thank on this one. There's if I'm omitting you, I could mention Brian Covey, I could mention Bob Lark, I could mention the late great Jeffrey Wasson, Greg Hutter. I could mention all sorts of great teachers in my life. But Karen Fannin was someone who had a conducting degree from Northwestern and was taking a year or two, I think it was 2 years of high school education as part of this, getting her doctorate. Now she's like director of bands, I believe, at University of Colorado. Like, so she was kind of slumming it essentially as part of, and took her study of jazz really seriously. I remember looking back, like she didn't know much about jazz literature because why would she? She's a euphonium player who conducted, and so she contacted Joel Spencer, a great jazz drummer, and was like, "What would it be beneficial for high schoolers to learn?" And then she studied those scores. I think a lot of people who are outside of jazz have a lot of assumptions about it. That it's simpler, that it's less complicated, that it's whatever. But she did the work, and I've always appreciated that she did the work. And like something that Kyle and I to this day really value is putting in the work, even if people don't fully clock it. Which is why I have to confess, I'm feeling extremely guilty because Radiant Black 32 came out with my placeholder sub high school level Spanish yesterday. Not the professional, beautifully translated Spanish. I'm still feeling guilty about that. That was
Well, that's the other thing is the languages you need in this book. There's Hebrew in here, there's Spanish in here,
Yeah.
There's French in here.
French
Yeah.
in here.
we really
more.
leaned on a lot of people, like the special thanks in the back. We had a lot of people helping us. The jam sessions led by King McGrath, because Roy McGrath helped me with all the Spanish. The Hebrew, we literally had. I had a friend, and then he's like, you know what? I'm going to take this to my rabbi. The rabbi helped us with that. Kyle and I are both Gentiles, and
To the source. There we go. Yeah.
and we had a second source look at it, which is funny because then years later somebody was like, I don't really like the Hebrew. I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. You got to take it up with this rabbi.
Not only had that, we had that peer review.
I don't
So,
even
yeah, it
understand
was,
what that means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's crazy. Something that I didn't think about. I learned so much doing this project, but like with the Hebrew, for example, it's like, well, the line breaks. You read this. I'm not sure if this
Right to
contains
left.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You read
Yeah.
right to left, but then there's line breaks, and so it's like, okay, well, where does the word end, and where do you slot that, and how do you do the lettering? So Haas, Hassan, who did our lettering, did an amazing job. Won the Eisner that year for best letterer.
Yeah. So someone that whose work
Not
I
his
followed
last.
was his work I followed before he started becoming like the most popular and prolific letterer in comics as like comics journalism. And to see his name, you're like every third book I pull is like, well, there's another Haas book there, another book there, and it's just it's his work is out of this world.
Igor and Haas tie the book together. I know that Igor, like you've correctly identified, goes through so many different styles and approaches and literally tools at times to convey that. But like by having him be a backbone, by being like one person with one voice, and Haas coming up with a way to do the lettering so that it really was a unique kind of thing. Like we really lucked out.
So before we get out of here, I did want to ask about that. Was that a choice at the beginning about we're going to have 6 different artists in 6 different time periods and all that, but you wanted to have specifically one colorist, like having a one letterer that you see that a lot, but like someone like, I know like someone like Junie Ba he's a cartoonist. He'll write and draw his own stuff there. So was it a conscious decision from the beginning to say we want to bring in one colorist so that there's some
Yeah.
connective tissue there, or was that just kind of how it fell? Was that part of the plan to because you're bringing in 6 diverse artists?
Yeah, Kyle was the mastermind behind getting all that in place, and like really had a keen pulse early on of like, how do we find a way to tell this as a cohesive narrative, considering that we're doing something that's so sprawling. Um, it was also a bit of a challenge because like that's a lot of ink,
Yeah.
a lot of work. And
Double
so
page, the double sized issues all the way through. So, it's,
yeah,
not just your standard 20 something, it's 40 something. So, no, I think the book, because you have those different styles there, I think you're right. Having one colorist there, even though the approach to each book is so radically different to match the artist and the time period and everything like that. There is when you sit down in the trade and you read it 1 through 6, you binge it through there. I think kind of subconsciously you have this connective tissue of you get a sense that you are following one story. I think a big part of that is the fact that you have one person who colored one person was coloring all the different
yeah.
eras, and so they knew what the changes were and what they were setting up before, and they can tie things together so that even if the reader doesn't notice it, may not notice it the first time explicitly, that it's there in the background, it's there on the page for them, that said subconsciously they're going to pick up on those things. And I think something like that, when you can get that across on the printed page, I think it's part of the reason, one of the things that I love so much about comics and telling stories in this way, that you can get those things of subconscious connectivity, that you're getting more out of the story than you maybe even know, more than just the words, more than just the pictures. There's feelings and vibes to it as you're reading it. Just like with any sort of kind of visual medium there, that you're not even picking up how the lighting or the camera angles work or things like that. In sequential art, you don't have those things, the static image.
Yeah.
And so when you get it from the coloring and the way characters are designed and things like that, and things in the background, when all that blends together and you get this story that normally has cohesive art, but when you don't have that and you have these wildly different artists, and have it still feel like one story, stuff like that is just, that's such a high bar to clear, and I think Deep Cuts works incredibly well like that.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
Specifically for issue 5, before I forget, I believe that's where Junie and Hassan first worked together for the first time, and they worked out together on a project afterward, just the two of them. The Unlikely
Yes, they
Story
did.
Yeah,
Yes, that's right, they did.
Felix and Macabre.
Yeah, the OGN they put out. Yes, that's right, they did.
Yeah.
So that came after us. Okay, wow.
And so like I know that they were in communication about like because Junie does some of his own sound effects. He builds it into the art. It's beautiful. And so like I think that's something that like all the layers of the text is the subtext is the text again, and like it's all about being creative. I think that's that. If we're gonna were there other questions you want to ask before we go, or are we wrapping up, or
No, I'll let you have the last word.
Yeah. Shoot for it, yeah.
The one thing that's important to me about this is that like obviously we love jazz. Obviously it's something that really means a lot to me, and to Kyle and to this team. But like it's a story about creativity, and it's a story about being an artist in a world that where that might not be an obvious kind of role in a lot of ways. Both whether you're whatever you're doing creatively is taking a risk in some kind of way, and it can be difficult to see where one is successful or one is failing. It can be ambiguous in that type of way, but it's worth doing. And I recommend, if anybody's on the fence here listening to this, follow through on it. Be creative, make something, work with people. There are people out there who want to work with you. Yeah, so that's that.
I don't think it doesn't get any better than that. So,
No.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. This was awesome, Joe. Thank you.
Yeah,
Oh, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
More than I could have ever asked for. And if your ears are burning in the future, we have kicked around. We go through different books all the time, but we've talked about doing Ordinary Gods, and I think you had
Oh, hey,
you had a hand in that as well. So
that was my grad school in a lot of ways.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, we were doing this, and then Kyle was like, "Let's keep like that was so that's the kicker to the whole thing is that like I thought this when we were working on it, there was a moment I was talking to my wife. I'm like, man, I love working in comics. I'm not sure if this is the last issue I'll ever be writing in my whole life or what. And thankfully, Kyle and I we really kindled a collaboration, and so
this Massiverse, Moon Man with Kid Cudi, like you're just all this, keep it going, right? Keep the train going.
It's been really fun, so I'm very thankful for that. If you want me to come back to talk about Ordinary Gods, boy, do I have things to talk about on that. So,
well, yeah, it's definitely. It's in the queue somewhere. We just don't know where, but now we might be motivated. Well, now that I know to look for Easter eggs everywhere, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so eager to dive back into that. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for listening. We're going to put links to everything discussed, well, almost everything discussed.
As much as we can.
And if you are listening and something was mentioned and you don't know where to find it and we didn't link to it, just leave a comment on some social platform somewhere, and we will find a way to